Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. Thursday, September 10th, 2020. Thank you for joining me today. I have a special daily wrap-up for you. We have Whitney Webb joining us right now for the entire show this time. We're going to go over one of her articles to start and some really interesting information that she just put a thread out on Twitter in regard to, and we're going to discuss this. It's only going to be talked about here. There's no article anywhere else, so it'll be a lot of really big information we're going to go over. And then she's going to join us as we go through some of the other things we were going to discuss today, some really big stuff. We have a huge study that came out, or an article from Swiss Policy Research, just completely lambasting the entire discussion of one of the most focused on articles or studies in regard to the mask concept, actually calling them to retract the entire thing, as well as some other big information, all centering around the complete deconstruction and demolition of their narrative they've been pushing on us this whole entire time. But to start off, we're going to get into an excellent article that is I definitely feel tied into this whole same thing, which I'm sure you guys will see as well. But it interestingly ties back to something that we've actually written about a long time ago on The Last American Vagabond, and of course finds its way back into the artificial intelligence and all the same things that we've been talking about. But first, Whitney Webb, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Great to be on.
It's always fun to have you on. The viewers love when you're here because there's information that we get when you're on the show that we just don't get anywhere else. So thanks for joining us. Now, I wanted to first, always, yeah. I mean, your research, as we should all know by now, is some of the top in regard to this topic, whether we're talking about, all the things we're going to get into. But of course, I'm biased. So let's get into something to start off here that I wanted to share that I thought was really interesting. And this is kind of a throwback to an article that was written by an old writer on The Last American Vagabond. And now just a quick caveat, this is from a long time ago. This was 2017, and the little, less produced, if you will, it was a long time ago. But nonetheless, it's worth listening to what he has to say in this podcast. But this is interesting because this is what Whitney Webb's article today, or yesterday or the day before, has to do with. And this article is entitled, "Is There More to the Ashton Kutcher Human Trafficking Story?" And if you remember, he gave a very heartfelt, just a plea for basically, unquestioningly funding things under the guise of, or rather, let's be fair, under the discussion of fighting human trafficking. And Whitney's article today gets into where it seems it's actually going. But it says the uneasy question here is whether or not it's a legitimate cause to support. That's in regard to his personal group, not in the fighting of human trafficking. And it says one has to wonder whether the government is trying to cover up their crimes rather than trying to prevent the crimes of others. People really need to take a step back from their emotions and examine this case with an open mind so they don't fall down the same trick of deceit that society is often duped into believing. Interesting. All the way back then. Now brings us to today, or rather the 8th, when this was published. By the way, on a side note, it's an article that was very clearly being suppressed. Entire websites being pulled down to keep this from your view, entitled Ashton Kutcher's NGO supplies police with free CIA-linked surveillance tool to protect kids. Now, this, to me, kind of brings us back, and this, you could argue whether or not you feel Ashton Kutcher is aware of this or not, but brings us back to this idea of using things like human trafficking, like pedophilia, to emotionally manipulate people into justifying seemingly unaccountable surveillance. Now, that's a perception. That's my perception based on this, at least something I think we can clearly see partially happening one way or the other. But at the end of the day, I feel like this ties in with everything that we're talking about today and the way that our governments operate. So let's start off today with, as usual, what was it about the story that caught your attention, and why'd you decide to start digging?
Well, actually, I was looking to write some other story a month or two ago. I was looking at the website Biometric Update, which has a lot of stories about these Orwellian digital identity things that are that they're trying to roll out because of the coronavirus crisis, and in relation to the recent article I did on refugees and ID 2020 and the International Rescue Committee. That I think I did last month or so. One of the suggested articles from Biometric Update was on this NGO called Thorn. And so I was reading about, it was actually not a recent article, it was from a few years ago, and I was reading about them, and there were some things that definitely stuck out to me, which of course are contained in the article, including the fact that even though, they sort of represent themselves as a a child protection organization, a child advocacy organization against human trafficking, specifically child trafficking. But the only thing they really do are these, surveillance tools that they give to law enforcement for free. That's exactly what they do. They have a newer one that they just came out with. The name I'm blanking on right now, but the one they've had for a couple years that they launched officially in 2016 is called Spotlight, which is this basically a software suite of surveillance tools, including surveillance tools that Amazon has imposed on itself a ban on the public on the sale of that software to law enforcement. So Amazon's publicly saying they're not going to sell their facial recognition software, for example, to U.S. police departments because of the outrage over police brutality and the militarization of police and whatnot. But they're using an NGO like Thorn and Thorn Spotlight. They're giving Spotlight is powered by Amazon Recognition, which is their facial recognition technology. So law enforcement officials or departments are still getting this software despite the ban, right? And of course, Thorn is partnered with Amazon. Ashton Kutcher and Jeff Bezos co-invest together in numerous companies, including other companies that are focused on technology-driven solutions for U.S. law enforcement, right? And this is all while we have Ashton Kutcher crying on camera, talking about how important it is to support police reform and Black Lives Matters, and you can't say all lives matters and all this stuff when he's funding the very, the high-tech militarization of police. He's funding that in private, but publicly, like, crying on camera saying it's bad, right? So, Amazon also is doing, their ban on the sale of this software to police as sort of a PR move, right? But in private, they're doing something very different, right? So
one point I'd add is that was one of the first things you added in your article, which I found very revealing, which immediately got my attention based on the same kind of ploy they've used in the past, where you point out that recognition, it was rightfully pointed out. And I think you mentioned the article that there was a study that found that it falsely tied 28 members of Congress to mug shots, falsely, obviously.
Yeah.
Some called it racist, some called it just simply inaccuracy. But at the end of the day, they used that to justify the moratorium. But then based on the guise of fighting child trafficking, they just start using it again. And this is kind of the point of all of this, right? That you can see very clear dishonesty or just, being bad at what they do or, bad technology. And then it just gets brushed away because, well, we're fighting bad things that you're emotionally invested in. That's alarming to me, even if they are actually fighting that, right?
I mean, all they have to do is say, oh, we're using this to fight human trafficking and protect children. And then people just stop there and they're like, oh, yeah, okay. They don't bother to look into this. And what's amazing to me is the fact that this software is being given to law enforcement agencies around the country for free with no oversight. No one knows what they're using it for. They're allegedly using it to combat child sex trafficking, but they can use it for anything else. There's no restrictions on what they can use the software for once they receive it, and they're giving it to them for free, right? So Amazon, when do they give anything to anyone for free, including their own freaking employees, right? In terms of benefits and stuff like that, right?
And we should add too that pointing out the honesty of this deception is not in any way to insinuate that we don't care about the concept of human trafficking or, this is the kind of fallacy argument we see. And I see the same kind of sentiment in the whole Q movement and the same idea where we're seeing this latch onto the idea of something that's very real, something that the Last American Vagabond's been covering for a decade. And yet they're using that to emotionally manipulate people away from what is really happening. That's my perception of it. But to your point, as you mentioned in the article, they're partners with Thorn, Amazon, Google, Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft. I mean, it's like the exact opposite of what you feel like. This kind of thing will be supported by people that would otherwise be absolutely diametrically against those kind of things. So how do you explain that, right? I mean, it's a ploy, in my opinion.
No, I definitely agree. And when we get into exactly who created Spotlight, because it wasn't just Amazon, right? So half of Spotlight was created by Amazon and uses Amazon's recognition with a K, which is their facial recognition technology. The other half is a company called Digital Reasoning that is definitely very suspect. mainly because they were largely funded, and they won't disclose how much funding they received, but it's essentially what got this company off the ground, millions of dollars from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture capital firm, or venture capital arm, that's also responsible for funding Google into existence. Also essentially created Palantir, the data mining company that also has ties to Ashton Kutcher's Thorn organization, which we can get into in a little bit as well. But, you know, at the same time, you have Amazon being one of the biggest contractors to not just the CIA, but the entire US intelligence community. So you have Ashton Kutcher seeking out two companies to create this software, you know, on behalf of Thorn that's going to protect kids online, right? And the two companies he chooses are both deeply tied to the CIA, either funded into existence by the CIA or a major contractor to the CIA. That should raise red flags for people, because the CIA has, you know, for anyone that's read my Epstein series, or any other you know, articles on the intelligence ties to, you know, sexual blackmail scandals or sex trafficking scandals, there is a ton of evidence of CIA involvement in you know, sexual abuse scandals involving children, sexual blackmail trafficking networks, with Epstein being the most recent example that's, you know, known to the public, right?
Most definitely.
So why are you choosing these guys to make your software? It definitely seems it should raise red flags for people.
It's a very good question. And I think we should add that you also pointed out that one of their partners is Polaris, which is a basically group tied to the Clinton Global Initiative, tied to USAID, you know, one of these very alarming ones that ties back to entities and actions of the kind of things we're talking about today.
Yeah, and Polaris is very, Polaris is very interesting, and someone should investigate them, because they're basically, they create a modern slavery database, right? And about, you know, gathering all this information about child trafficking and all this stuff. It's deeply tied. It's a member of the Clinton Global Initiative, the same time Ghislaine Maxwell was part of the Clinton Global Initiative. Remember, the Clinton Global Initiative conceived of and initially funded by Jeffrey Epstein, right? So it should be very alarming that Polaris, which is dedicated specifically to child trafficking, is tied to the Clinton Global Initiative, which, you know, as I just mentioned, essentially created by, you know, now the most notorious intelligence-linked sex trafficker of children in United States, recent United States history, right? It's scandalous. Anyway, Polaris has a lot of partnerships with some of the companies that also back Thorn, including Palantir, right, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a Silicon Valley company created by Peter Thiel and a guy named Joe Lonsdale and some other people. Their first client, after being funded, receiving a large amount of their funding from the CIA's In-Q-Tel, their only client for the first 3 years of their existence as a company until 2008 was the CIA. So they were, you know, working exclusively for the CIA for the first 3 years of their existence as a company, and the CIA essentially gave them feedback and developed their products, you know, over those 3 years, right? So, you know, these are the people partnering with these Save the Children NGOs. This should be, you know, huge red flags for people.
And it's, as you make clear in this, and a lot of people, I mean, this is very easy to look up. The CIA has an incredibly dark history of doing exactly the kind of things. This should be one of the last entities that would be allowed to be involved with the face of stuff like this, or even behind the scenes. And the connection I was making in regard to Polaris and the Clinton Global Initiative and the Epstein Network, which you clearly point out, is that Ashton Kutcher, as you in the article you point out, he got to start modeling for Abercrombie and Fitch, which until very recently was owned by Leslie Wexner. So you could almost kind of see this, you know, and this is superficial. We couldn't prove that that's how this worked out. Maybe, but nonetheless, you can always find these trails. And no, I very much agree. And it shows you this kind of, it suggest at the very least that someone like Ashton Kutcher is not even aware that he's being this tool in this whole entity, or it could be the exact opposite.
I don't know. I think a lot of actors in Hollywood, you know, like to, you know, cultivate a certain public persona, but in private, they act very different. Let's remember too, Ashton Kutcher, very involved with the Friends of the IDF fundraiser, lends his celebrity to raising millions of dollars for the Israel Defense Forces, which regularly, you know, murder children in Gaza and other, you know, parts of of occupied Palestine, for example, right? He's also, you know, as I said earlier, a major investor in these Orwellian law enforcement companies. And then here he is giving his morning shout out to the CIA.
That was a good time to share that.
Hashtag gratitude to the intelligence agency that murders presidents and civil rights leaders and sexually abuses children, right? So, you know, I don't really think he's clean in this. I think he has to know to some extent. Remember, you have to keep in mind too, aside from the public persona of Ashton Kutcher, he has also fancied himself a major venture capitalist in tech. And he's been his business partner in those ventures is an Israeli citizen, and he has ties to Israel's initial venture capital program aimed at creating its high-tech sector, which of course is infused with all these Unit 8200 guys. Going back, you know, that was first created in the early 1990s. Ashton Kutcher is definitely a part of that now and a very enthusiastic supporter of Zionism, right? So he's definitely, I you know, the whole, oh, well, there's no way he knows what's going on, as I had people tell me on Twitter yesterday. You know, I think, you know, these actors are very good at making you think they're a certain way because they're actors, right? When Ashton Kutcher gave his, you know, teary-eyed, you know, speech about child trafficking in front of Congress, I mean, you know, he's an actor, right? And just like I mentioned earlier, he's tearfully talking about Black Lives Matters while privately he's, you know, doing all this stuff to arm law enforcement to the teeth with all these AI driven technology, you know, tools and all of that. It definitely seems to be an act to me, but if people wish to continue believing that he's one of the good guys, I mean, you know.
Well, it's, you know, it's he's arming them with the very things that movement is pointing to, the very things that these companies employees are protesting from the company. It's inherently contradictory. So you're right. It doesn't make any sense. And to make clear my opinion, I think very much that he's aware of what's going on, whether he's playing the game or not. My point in that saying that was just simply to point out that it's interesting to watch how these people are cultivated. And you can see how, you know, from Abercrombie and Fitch as a young kid to now, and, you know, to a point to whether or not they're Manchurian candidate type of things, or, you know what I mean? It's something to think about. It's kind of alarming to watch how their progression, you know?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to see that he started modeling for a Wexner-owned company. Remember, Epstein was very involved in all of Wexner's modeling, you know, affairs related to their retail brands, right? So,
well, on that note, though, let's jump into Thorne's, you know, the people that work with it. You had a whole section about their boardroom and in the board of directors and the different people and how they are. Again, it's incredible to see this, and this is surface level stuff. You know, the kind of people tied in with this are, again, like it's like a joke. It's like it's meant to insult you when you dig in to find out who these.
It should insult you, because remember, these are, you know, they're claiming to be all about anti-child trafficking. But for example, one of their board members is a lady named Suzanne Bell, who is the top lawyer for Silicon Valley clients for the DC-based law firm Covington and Burling. Covington and Burling, their other partners include John Bolton and former Attorney General Eric Holder. Covington and Burling was involved in the coup that overthrew the government of Honduras in 2009, which was also aided and abetted by the Clinton-led State Department.
And we should also note that every single time we have one of these destabilizations, human trafficking goes through the roof. You know, interesting to point out that Clinton, Silsby got caught trafficking children from Haiti. Clinton got and it's ridiculous that this, you know, the correlation here. So causing these kind of destabilizations causes the kind of thing they're trying to stop, you know, and this is the people on the same side.
And Suzanne Bell, right, as a lawyer, if you look at her expertise in law, there's nothing about protecting children or child trafficking or advocacy for children there. It's about artificial intelligence, financial technology, the Internet of Things, blockchain, things like that, right? Nothing about kids at all. Then you have another guy, Ray Chambers, who's involved with the World Health Organization, the UN, and the UN's Agenda 2030, who's also co-authored papers with Bill Gates and co-founded the End Malaria Council with Bill Gates. Of course, Bill Gates being the former head of Microsoft. Microsoft also a partner of Thorne.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting with all these people is that you could, it wouldn't take long at all to take a quick search and find a lot of leading people in the world that either really do or ostensibly fight human trafficking, but they have credentials and bona fide, you know, they're the people that would be involved with something like this. But yeah, you look at the people who are involved with this, and it seems that they're all the same people that are pushing, you know, the Internet of Things, the artificial intelligence, the surveillance networks, and yet their claim is that, oh, well, those are the things we're using to fight this, but they don't really seem too interested in actually fighting human trafficking. It just seems that
No.
they using that as an excuse to create what they've always been trying to create. Sounds just like COVID-19.
Right. Like Ray Chambers, for example, who was just talking about with the ties to Bill Gates. He fancies himself a philanthropist, right, through his work with the World Health Organization and all of this. But his other charity in the US is called America's Promise Alliance. And he co-founded that with Colin Powell, former Secretary of State who helped ally us into the war with Iraq, right? Who I'm sure really cares about philanthropy. It's worth pointing out that Colin Powell is also on the board, was added to the Silicon Valley venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins very recently, which of course was recently in the news because it invited Ghislaine Maxwell to their Christmas parties years after her involvement with Epstein and, you know, procuring these underage girls for him was well known, right? So that's where Colin Powell works now.
It's just, you know, it's almost not, it's not surprising at all, but at the same time, you're just going, how can it be so clear, you know?
Yeah, really quick, just to try and get through this kind of quickly because we have a lot to get through. So the other board member I want to highlight is Joe Lonsdale, who's one of the co-founders of Palantir. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the CI connections to Palantir are very obvious. And so Joe Lonsdale is intimately involved in that. He currently is a venture capitalist, runs Formation 8. Which is, you know, focused on these cybersecurity startups and all of that. But he was also recently accused of egregious sexual misconduct by his ex-girlfriend, who accused him of depriving her of food, physically abusing her, and raping her repeatedly, among other things. So this is, you know, the guy that's on the board trying to protect children from online sexual abuse is the guy that starves his girlfriends and rapes them. That seems very, you know, more red flags. But, you know, apparently no one's really been, you know, paying attention to this organization. And I think that, you know, just from what we've gone over so far, and there's still a lot more to get into that I go into in my article that is very alarming. Yeah. You know, there's a lot to be concerned about. Yeah.
I mean, again, to bring it back with the same kind of cultivation aspect, as you wrote, that the woman, Doherty, I believe is how you pronounce her name, she previously modeled for Abercrombie and Fitch, right? The same. So you can see this, it's an Epstein kind of scenario we're talking about here. You can see the cultivation there, you know? But the next person to get into, which I think is just outrageously obvious when you see the tiebacks to the same groups, the same entities that have been facilitating these things, or rather, you know, trying to fend off the accusations, someone like Ernie Allen, in regard to, you wrote about I believe it's the Dutroux affair, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
NCMEC. So would you touch on him?
The Dutroux affair was basically like Europe's Epstein scandal. It happened in the late 90s. Basically, this guy who was publicly an unemployed electrician was kidnapping and had a bunch of girls chained up in his basement that were abused by the most powerful people in Belgium's political and economic establishment, right? And once these crimes came to light, there was this huge police cover-up, and like as many, I think, as like 20 witnesses were murdered in the course of this investigation. I mean, just an insane cover-up that actually inspired 300,000 Belgians to march in the streets. It's remembered as the White March. So under all of this controversy, right, the Prime Minister of Belgium at the time, who's one of the architects of this cover-up, of the Dutroux affair, contacts the guy in the US that is the president of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Ernie Allen. And he essentially asks Ernie Allen for advice about what to do. And the fact that the advice from Ernie Allen was so, you know, successful, other countries with similar scandals apparently started to reach out to him in the late 90s. And this inspired him to create the International Center for Exploited and Missing Children, which was launched by Hillary Clinton in 1999. Okay, so basically, to me, this suggests Ernie Allen's involvement with, conspiring essentially with one of the architects of the Dutroux affair cover up, and then creating an international organization, right, focused on events like the Dutroux affair and things like that being launched by Hillary Clinton. While the Clintons were already involved with Epstein by that point, it's worth pointing out,
Yeah.
very alarming. And so Ernie Allen is also the point man for the McCain Institute's combating human trafficking program, and also the child protection advisor to Thorne. Okay, so the McCain Institute, it's worth pointing out, Ashton Kutcher himself is a member of this, and Cindy McCain, right? He's part of this combating human trafficking program at the McCain Institute. So is Cindy McCain, who just a few months ago admitted on camera that she and everyone else, her words, knew what Epstein was doing the whole time.
Which is such an important point that people the media tried to just despair and pretend like it was just her trying to be, miswording what she was saying. It was a very clear statement to try to
I mean, you can look at mainstream media reports on Epstein from before his first arrest, and there's people talking about Ghislaine like whipping underage girls and teaching them sex techniques from like 2003, right? So like people knew. You know what I mean? So Cindy McCain admits that, and obviously they didn't take any steps to go after Epstein, despite knowing it and having this like super well-funded combating human trafficking program. But what they do have is Lynn Forrester de Rothschild works at the McCain Institute also, and she, of course, is a longtime pal of Jeffrey Epstein's and is the person that introduced Epstein to Alan Dershowitz, and in 1995 is on the record talking to Bill Clinton while he was sitting president about Epstein and currency manipulation in the same sentence, right? So it's definitely, or sorry, she says stability of currency markets, but these people.
Yes.
That's not what they really mean. Anyway, very alarming to see all these McCain tie-ins. And then you have Ernie Allen being, essentially the point man for this, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which influences which children appear on Amber Alerts and other missing child bulletins that go throughout the United States, meaning that if someone powerful doesn't want a child to be found, for example, and has contacts, I guess you could say, at the center, in theory, they could keep that child they don't want found from appearing in Amber Alerts or in these missing child bulletins that this network handles. And also the National Center that Ernie Allen ran for a long time. One of his underlings, Ernie Allen's underlings, is the creator of Hillary for America and was the director of grassroots campaigning for Hillary's 2016 campaign, right? So there's definitely a lot of tie-ins between this group and the Clintons, in addition to the fact that, Hillary herself launches the international arm of this organization.
And it's worth noting as well, and this is incredible to me. Not only just really, I've written about this in the past, but it's worth noting that Laura Silsby, trying to get the image up so I could just show it, and this is directly to your point. If I could just share this really quickly. Laura Silsby, who, remember, is the woman that worked, or who changed her name. It was Laura Gaylor. Now it was Laura Silsby, was the one caught trafficking children in Haiti that Hillary Clinton got off. The whole story. She works for Alert Sense, or at least she did, following that, which is a group that works in letting us. So it's exactly to your point, right? So these people are essentially being set up in a position that allows them, or you could argue that that's the case. So either you could say these are people that are trying to do what they can to stop this, but based on their history and evidence around them, it seems more clearly to your point that they're putting themselves, positioning people in the places to be able to control it rather than help it.
Right. Well, I'm not trying to say that everyone that works at this National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is like a bad seed. Okay. I'm just pointing out that the leadership, right, is pretty suspect.
Absolutely.
When you look at, what they've been doing over the years. Ernie Allen also in his later years at this organization responsible for moving to tech-driven solutions to fight child sex trafficking, right? Through partnering with Microsoft and also with Amazon. So this National Center, which by the way is largely funded by the US government, also, is giving Amazon's facial recognition software to US law enforcement. and also Microsoft's Photo DNA software for free to U.S. law enforcement under the guise of combating child trafficking. You know, it's definitely concerning. And there's a whole saga that I go into about Ernie Allen and the very shady ties of this national center to this website called Backpage, which, you know, was essentially where most of child sex trafficking victims were being advertised for exploitation. And eventually they got investigated, and the founders of their site got arrested and all this stuff. But before that, you know, this national center, and Ernie Allen specifically, was meeting with those guys allegedly about having them clamp down on these images, and then later turned around and said they weren't doing enough and all of this stuff. But actually, when Ernie Allen ended up sort of turning and becoming a critic of this group was when Backpage had started to cooperate so effectively with law enforcement. They were, you know, essentially tracking down too many pedophiles and sex traffickers. Right. And I don't want to go into too much detail. It's a really huge scandal, and I only really give a summary of it. And it's been, you know, a legal battle going on for years. But essentially, those arrests and the takedown of the site, it first happened in 2016 when those arrests were made the same year that Thorn's Spotlight comes out, you know, to be used. Very convenient timing there. So this, what was considered a very effective tool for law enforcement to go after child sex abuse online, right, Backpage, ends up getting taken down, right, and then replaced with Thorn, with all of these CIA connections and, you know, this Ernie Allen guy and all of this stuff taking its place, essentially, in terms of partnering with U.S. law enforcement, right? Definitely very interesting. But since 2016, last year, several leaked government memos of the prosecutors of the people that were behind Backpage revealed that U.S. prosecutors knew that they were doing essentially too good of a job, you know, tracking these you know, perverts down, right? And the person that signed off on the arrest warrants for these people at that particular time, when the investigation into them started. So the investigation concluded in 2016 with the arrest, but the green light to go after them when they started going, becoming this effective tool for U.S. law enforcement was actually Kamala Harris, the current candidate, you know, for vice president. And this is interesting, given the revelations that have come out about Kamala Harris running interference for a bunch of pedophile priests in California, right? So definitely something to keep in mind there.
Yeah. I mean, the whole point of that is it's a very, you know, it's a fine line to walk to pretend that you're allowing something bad to enable to stop something bad, you know, and it's a murky area where they can abuse the situation. And that, I don't think that should ever really be allowed. And I know there's so much on this article. So, and there's some other things we want to get to. The one last part that I just wanted to bring up, which brings us into the next part, was the concept of Thorn and the idea of actually promoting this concept of mass scanning of children's irises as a means of protecting them. And this totally brings us into this idea of, you know, you could argue ostensibly fighting things at a broad level, but when you're actually calling for such specific hands-on information from children, it becomes alarming with all the stuff we're seeing. So
well, yeah, because
you want to note on that?
Well, sorry.
Go ahead.
The lag. Well, I just wanted to point out, look at the people that are partnered with Thorn, for example, Microsoft. They're a major backer of ID 2020 and are pushing for this iris scanning and refugee communities that they're trying to tie to, you know, create a digital identity, like an ID card essentially, but it's, you know, biometric scanning of irises, but it's also tied to, you know, financial activities, vaccination records, things like that, right?
Exactly.
Definitely a very Orwellian concept that they're currently beta testing in refugee communities. But essentially what Thorn is allowing, you know, police department to, you know, Thorn Spotlight, they describe it in some articles alongside other tech companies or tech focused NGOs as child recognition technologies. So now we move from facial recognition technologies to child recognition technologies. Okay, so yeah, I'm not going to say it's like it's bad to have, like, you know, a technology that allows a child that's been kidnapped to be found, right? That's not what I'm trying to say here. But why, you know, is software that's supposed to have that as its ostensible purpose being, you know, run and directed by people with all these shady ties to intelligence, or the cover up of the Dutroux affair and all this stuff that we just went over. It's sort of like having, the fox guard the hen house, right? So why are we doing that, when it comes to children and giving, all these tech-powered solutions to law enforcement? We also don't know, for example, since, remember the software is provided for free, it's very possible that a lot of the data or the way that program is used, it has a backdoor for Amazon and Digital Reasoning and these other companies that developed it, allowing them to siphon off that data and use it for whatever purpose. It's worth pointing out too that Amazon and Microsoft, both in recent years, I think actually this year and last year specifically, have come under fire from parental advocacy groups because of the ease of finding child pornography on their servers. In Microsoft's case, it's the Bing search engine coming under fire for the ease of finding very disturbing images of the sexual abuse of children. And in Amazon's case, Amazon has essentially taken a policy of inaction on removing child sexual abuse material on its cloud servers, which of course, power 6% of websites and are also the cloud servers for US intelligence, right? So that's definitely very concerning because you don't hear a peep from Thorn or from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children about their partnerships with Amazon and Microsoft, given those alarming revelations. But of course, they were the first to point the finger at Backpage, accusing Backpage of taking an action against this material, when in fact, leaked evidence has now shown that they were doing the exact opposite. Right. So, just the hypocrisy is astounding. And I definitely think this needs, to be investigated at the very least. And I think it's worth pointing out, too, a lot of NGOs that claim to advocate for children, whether it's the International Rescue Committee, Save the Children, or a group like Thorn, a lot of them have been exposed in recent years as being involved in awful scandals involving the abuse of the children they were supposed to protect. Okay, especially Save the Children, which a lot of people think of, oh yeah, that's like, you think of a charity that advocates for children, that's the first one they think of, right? In the 1980s, one of their main fundraisers was Ghislaine Maxwell, okay? And they were caught by the UK government itself of their workers in vulnerable populations, forcing families into a sex for food situation where they withheld food from the families, refugee families they were supposed to be taken care of, unless they ponied up one of their preteen daughters to be sexually exploited by these people, right? So we need to stop buying the public justification we are fed from these groups that, oh yeah, we protect children and you can go back to sleep now. No, these groups need to be scrutinized and investigated. It doesn't, having the people that are tied to predators being involved in these organizations that protect children gives them access to children, and there's not enough oversight of them.
Yeah, so true. So true. I mean, the people in positions of authority need to be held to a higher standard, not less like equivocations. And like with the police today, it's like, oh, well, we're going to give them immunity because they're in such a position. No, that's the opposite of what should happen. They should be more scrutinized, like all the stuff we're talking about. And it's clear in one way or another, as you made a good point in saying that. No one's trying to suggest that everybody in these things are bad, but it's clear that at some level they're picking and choosing how to apply it, and that's just simply not okay. And I find it interesting too that what you pointed out there is that you can right now go on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and find right now things that violate their policies, such as things like pedophilia, such as things like racism or whatever else. Right this moment you can find them, yet they're willing to censor political content with no questions asked. Recognize what that shows us today, And so to bring this forward into the current stuff that's going on right this moment, I find it very interesting to point this stuff out. They were talking about the Ohio State News putting out a publication saying, quote, the CDC advised parents to prepare for children to be detained overnight in case of a disaster, listing COVID-19 as a biological threat that would qualify as a disaster. So it's just this broad concept that we might just have to come and take your children because danger. That's a dangerous precedent that they're setting, and it's not even just here. We also saw Tennessee doing the same thing, yet they did pull it back based off a lot of pressure from the people, the people they're supposed to represent. But I argue it's not going to actually go away. Same kind of thing, well-being checks, but just for children. So it's just this weird push that we're seeing right now, even though children are according to the CDC, at a 0% risk of catching COVID-19. It's like 0.00001, but they round it to 0, right? And it's just very, very alarming stuff we're seeing. Now, I also wanted to point out, do you want to comment on those?
Just the fact that, I want people to remember back a few months ago, Bill Gates, I forget what interview it was, but he was talking about how there was going to be a bioterror event at some point this fall, as if we didn't have enough things predicted to go wrong this fall. So the fact that, they're saying there's some biological weapons threat from COVID-19, I think is a little alarming in that context. Is the fact that we also have all the dark winter signaling for over the past couple months, that there's going to be some sort of dark winter event. Of course, dark winter being the simulation that preceded the 2001 anthrax attacks.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Good point. Now, it's also interesting to point out that this whole point is about fighting this stuff, right? It's about lessening, and the interesting point is this has been going on for how long now? But what you'll note, and this doesn't necessarily prove that this is the correlation is not causation, but I find it revealing that right now, human trafficking is more than ever in the United States, as well as for the most part the world, but it has increased. As it says, the number of people falling victim to human trafficking around the world continues to grow. Up until 2018, the number of human trafficking victims identified worldwide more than tripled. And especially in the United States, as they're pointing out, human trafficking now is a multi-billion-dollar business worldwide. Cases increased in the United States, and this is during the time it's happening. So that doesn't mean that they're doing the opposite, but it seems to suggest at the very least what they're doing is not working. So that's a question that we need to be asking, and I think it's not. It leads to the same kind of point that this is surface level and not really doing what they're saying it's doing.
It's worth pointing out that, a lot of the entities most responsible for sex trafficking in the United States are contractors to the U.S. government. Look at DynCorp, for example. On the record on several occasions historically, kidnapping kids, forcing kids into prostitution, pedophilia scandals, things like that. They're still allowed to win contracts from the U.S. government. They're one of the biggest, they're a contractor to DHS, into the military, and they've been caught trafficking kids. One of the biggest scandals for them involving sex trafficking was during the NATO bombing of Bosnia in Serbia during that period of time, and the balkanization of that area, right? So, as you mentioned earlier, conflict zones become a free-for-all for human trafficking, and it's on the record that a lot of times those are either Western government-linked NGOs or U.S. government-linked contractors doing that. So I would argue that a lot of the arrests we do hear about are honestly just, consolidation for the establishment, where they basically can have a monopoly over this type of illegal activity because no one can touch them. Right? Because they control the authorities that are responsible for allegedly protecting children and busting these rings. But, they arrest the little guys. They have more, control over the industry for themselves.
I agree. That's why I had this pulled up in general, because this is sort of the argument you get is that, well, we've seen this increase since Trump was elected. And really what we saw was a spike early, and we've seen it actually increase since then. But this is still pointed to as, look, they're doing something about it, right? But I argue, and this is the same point I made then, is that what they're ultimately doing is taking down people that, they're not taking down the people that are executing it. They're taking down the people that are being used to execute it, right? The middlemen, the people that are there, right. Not the people they wipe them out and they just keep going. And this gives you that kind of illusion. And that's not to suggest that they're not trying to stop it somewhere along the line. But at the end of the day, we can see the opposite coming to fruition now, where it's actually increasing. So I agree completely with your sentiment. Now, that brings us to another discussion that we wanted to talk about today that Whitney Webb did a thread on. There's a lot of really interesting information here. So if you want to take the lead here and run us through some of this, I'm sure people will be very interested.
Yeah, sure. So I did this thread about Keith.
Did you want to share your
screen?
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll get there in a sec. Well, I'll just do it now. All right. So here we go. So as you saw there on the beginning of this Twitter thread, former NSA chief Keith Alexander joins Amazon's board of directors. Of course, we were talking a lot about Amazon just now, being a major CIA contractor. Of course, the former head of the NSA now joining its board of directors should raise a lot of red flags. Of course, Alexander resigned from the NSA over the fallout from the Edward Snowden leaks. and was one of the people that championed a lot of the programs and instigated a lot of the programs that the Snowden leaks exposed. But of course, it wasn't all Alexander. A lot of them began under his predecessor, Michael Hayden, who Alexander took over the NSA from, and then Hayden moved to become CIA director during that period of time. Michael Hayden has rebranded as a resistance hero, by the way, being part of the anti-Trump quote unquote resistance with Bill Kristol and all of those other fun guys. But anyway, here it talks about how he was involved with PRISM and things like that, and the fact that Amazon is in a battle for the cloud computing contract with the Pentagon, right? Which has gone to Microsoft. But it's worth pointing out. Oh,
just to note Amazon, the idea, like this is talking about the same thing that they're arguably putting in under the guise of child trafficking. It's just this Amazon surveillance and all, tracking, the whole same kind of thing, except this isn't being pushed in under the guise of human trafficking. So it just shows you that they have different angles they're pushing this in from, just like what we're dealing with.
Oh, totally. And it's definitely concerning, all of this, when we think about it all together in a big picture way, when we look at what we'll get into a second, the ties of Jeff Bezos to Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. But before that, we're going to talk about just a little bit, go over how Keith Alexander, while he was at the NSA, kept his financial information, his investments in companies, a secret. And then, of course, when he resigned from being director of the NSA, this information came out. You can find more at this Vice article that talks about the different things he was invested in. A lot of them were, of course, surveillance technology companies. So he's creating even, expanding surveillance programs while also investing behind the scenes in surveillance companies that were set to benefit from those very programs. I mean, that's pretty obviously obvious corruption. After he leaves, Keith Alexander creates this cybersecurity company. You can see here, he founded it called IronNet, which charges up to $1 million per month to protect your, I know, it's a pretty big fee, right? To protect your stuff from the bad, evil hackers. So you can hear him talking about how IronNet is great because of unparalleled government experience with the NSA, Cyber Command, and DARPA, and also high-profile commercial and Silicon Valley connections, right? Oh, so great. Just like we talk about sometimes, how Silicon Valley and the intelligence community and DARPA and the Pentagon have all essentially merged into one giant blob that, of course, you see on the National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence, right? Here's another company that's very much a part of that network. And look at all the awards they've won, right? But our investment partners, Kleiner Perkins, remember I mentioned them a second ago. Colin Powell, also Ghislaine Maxwell was attending their functions, among other things. They were one of the early investors in Facebook, a lot of ties, to the Silicon Valley elite, I guess you could say. And then C5 Capital, who we'll get into in a little bit here. As I mentioned earlier, the Kleiner Perkins, Ghislaine Maxwell thing, this is the article about that from July 6th of this year, talking about, the former Silicon Valley venture capital firm they're talking about in that headline is Kleiner Perkins. So here's their executive team. You have Keith Alexander, chairman of the board, founder, and co-CEO. The other co-CEO is this William Welch guy, right? Who was previously vice president and general manager for Hewlett Packard Software in the Americas. Okay, this is important because here he was at HP during the time that Carly Fiorina was CEO. And of course, here's her ties to US intelligence, the CEO and the CIA. I recommend reading this article because it's very revealing. First, she collaborated with Michael Hayden when he was head of the NSA, okay? And then he moves to the CIA. Hayden becomes director of national intelligence. And then he once again turns to Fiorina, and she went on to chair the CIA's external advisory board. Right. And here, the subtitle of the article talks about how she managed and advised the poobahs at Langley. OK, so HP is a company with a lot of involvement with the NSA and the CIA. Here in this paragraph, you can read about her involvements in a lot of the post 9/11 surveillance programs that Hayden started and that Alexander expanded. Right. So that's the co-CEO of IronNet. Here are IronNet's featured partners. We have Amazon, right? We have Microsoft, We have the Global Cyber Alliance, which actually has a lot of Unit 8200 companies on it. We have Raytheon, right? Booz Allen Hamilton,
Right.
which is, of course, where Edward Snowden had worked.
What is the brain trace one? Are you familiar with that one?
No,
I'll have to look into
definitely.
that. That's
It's
interesting.
probably it says intelligent cybersecurity, so I'm
Of
assuming it's
course.
in one of those AI-driven cybersecurity companies. But yeah, definitely interesting to see all their fun partners here that they feature on their website.
And I hope nobody's missing the obvious tie-in that all of the, not necessarily all of the partners, but all the people that she's talking about in this thread are all tied in with the same agendas and all the different, whether COVID-19,
Oh yes,
all the same stuff.
well, we're about to get to that now. Here is
Sorry,
the
go ahead.
Cyber Alliance to defend our healthcare. Right? I mean, I just like, how can you not look at this and not laugh? It's like the most transparent thing ever. Anyway, this was set up by C5 Capital, which, as I showed earlier, is one of the backers of Keith Alexander's IronNet. Basically, what this organization does is essentially the same as what CTI League, who we talked about, or you talked about, covered my article on that. Essentially what they do, which is protecting US hospitals for free, right? So it's an alliance of all of these different companies that you can see here, corporate partners, right, that are all protecting US hospitals for free.
Now,
and they don't tell you,
the tie-in with the same concept with this is similar to what they're pushing with the police surveillance human trafficking thing, right? Oh, we're doing it, altruistically, it's for free. It's interestingly connected there.
And it's for free.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And, a lot of hospitals, as I mentioned in my CTI League article, have been accepting this free health from all these intelligence connected private companies because they have been either defunded by the federal government, or they're experiencing a jump in cyber attacks related to COVID-19, or they've had to lay off staffers, or things like that, things that have essentially forced them into a position where they are more likely than they otherwise would be to accept this free health, right? Especially when it's promoted by the government. In the case of CTI League, which is partnered with the government. And of course, this is, has IronNet, which is, Keith Alexander, former head of the NSA. The NSA will protect you, for the people that still believe that that's what it's about. But anyway, here's some of their other companies. It's worth pointing out that one of the companies in the Cyber Alliance here is the Global Cyber Center at Cyber NYC, which, if we go here, I wrote about for Mint Press News in February, has controversial ties to Israeli intelligence, including the Jeffrey Epstein-linked mega group. And it's run by Israel-based Jerusalem Venture Partners and SOSA. If you want to know more about that organization and how New York City taxpayers have essentially been on the hook to fund this, you should read this article. But I will point out that the founder of Jerusalem Venture Partners and former member of Israel's Knesset, who's running this Cyber NYC thing that's partnered with IronNet to protect your hospitals, says that the center was set up to only assist Israeli high-tech companies in collaborating with customers and companies in the US and around the world.
But wait, that's racist though. You can't say that. You can't say
well,
that.
That's what he said, right?
Obviously.
So, it's supposed to be a thing that they claim is going to benefit New York, but then the guy is saying it's going to benefit Israeli high-tech companies that are tied to Unit 8200,
which is the common thread.
Other things.
Which is the common thread in all these things you've written about, whether it's Rhode Island or, even discussing the idea of funding projects that the Israeli government, creates and then fund the U.S. buy with Iron Dome kind of scenario where we're funding it and then we buy it from them. It's ridiculous that U.S. taxpayers are on the hook for all of this stuff. And it doesn't, please continue. It's just absurd to me.
No, it's insane. So that's interesting too, because if we look at CTI League is a combination of a former commander at Unit 8200, Israel's Unit 8200, their NSA, and Microsoft, right? And so then on the other side, you have the separate alliance that does the same thing, right? That's the former head of the US NSA and the Global Cyber Center at Cyber NYC that's tied with Israeli intelligence, right? So just interesting to point that out. And, here are some of the other companies for people that might be interested in taking a deeper look. But moving on.
Alarming picture being painted for
the just wait. We're not even halfway through. It gets much worse.
Rock and roll.
Okay. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the Amazon is a major contractor of the CIA. Here you can see just some of the headlines. I mean, there's infinite ones about the CIA's deal with Amazon. CIA long relied exclusively on Amazon for its cloud computing, right? America's newest military giant, Amazon, right? Why their collaboration with the CIA is so ominous. CIA plans to spend billions on cloud computing with Amazon, right? Amazon is launching a secret cloud service for the CIA, all of this stuff, right? Well, Amazon, their CEO and creator, Jeff Bezos, invited Ghislaine Maxwell in 2018 to his secretive writers retreat, which is very exclusive. Not a lot of people go to that. And she subsequently bragged about her pal, Jeff Bezos. Ghislaine Maxwell bragged about pal Jeff Bezos from the Daily Beast, right? Getting very involved with Silicon Valley. Of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's intelligence-linked sister, Isabel Maxwell, who I've written a little bit about, also very involved with Silicon Valley, specifically Bill Gates, among other people. All right, so here you have Jeff Bezos making recruiting trips to Israel to hire Unit 8200 tech startups, talking about the Israeli startup that he acquired in 2015 and how they're kind of late to the party because Google and Microsoft were there first. Sorry, I have a rogue cat attempting to get in front of the screen.
So I just note while that happened, just it's the fact that this can be so, I'm almost just watching you go through this, and the fact that it can be so readily apparent, like the idea, even just taking the Silicon Valley aspect or the McCain Institute, or these ideas of very, very real, obvious foreknowledge or just knowledge while this stuff was going on. And nothing happens about it. I always reflect on that and ask myself, how in the world anybody can look at this stuff and walk away thinking that that's conspiracy theory and they're all good people fighting for good things. It's just so obvious to me. And it just, this shows you this blockage in people's minds.
Right, and here, one last point, Amazon is a contractor for state-owned Israel Aerospace Industries, right? So continuing on, Jeff Bezos, among other, Google co-founder Elon Musk of Tesla, Marissa Mayer of Yahoo, attended an elite private dinner with Jeffrey Epstein 2 years after his first arrest, right? Then this is a very interesting Jeff Bezos-Epstein connection. The headline reads, "Why did Jeffrey Epstein's private jet fly to Riyadh on the eve of the 2016 election?" Right? Definitely really weird. So Jeffrey Epstein's private jet flew from Paris to somewhere in Riyadh and then returned to Paris 48 hours later, while Epstein was there having these meetings with MBS, apparently, right? Remember, MBS had ties to Kushner, who's, very involved with Israel and all of this stuff, right? Also was holding meetings with Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, okay? Definitely kind of weird coincidence there. And of course, they didn't, declined to answer questions about why Epstein and Bezos were there at the same time, noting that Bezos attended at least 2 dinners with Epstein. Of course, no mention of his ties to Ghislaine Maxwell that I went over earlier, who talked about Jeff Bezos being her great pal.
That suggests some more connections with the Trump administration too, like the idea of the connection with Saudi Arabia and his election. That's an interesting one.
It is an interesting one that gets ignored a lot, but definitely worth pointing out when we're talking about Bezos and intelligence here. Sorry, I have a very frustrating cat. He's very needy. Anyway, here we go with Keith Alexander and what they describe as the cybersecurity think tank Team 8. We'll get into in a little bit. Team 8 was created by the former commander, the head of the entire Unit 8200, which, as I said earlier, is basically Israel's NSA. And they have hosted Keith Alexander on more than one occasion. Here is Team 8's Rethink Cyber event, highlighting Keith Alexander's talking about how great he is, And then here we have an article about, let me go up to the top, about Team 8, how it was created by Israeli spy master Nadav Zafrir. I think that's how you say it. Anyway, as I said, he's the former head of Unit 8200, but he partnered with Google's Eric Schmidt to launch Team 8. Okay, remember, Eric Schmidt has come up a lot in my reporting this year over his, designs over artificial intelligence policy in the US, his ties to Henry Kissinger. A lot of people have started describing Eric Schmidt as essentially the new Henry Kissinger in terms of being that behind the scenes deep state operative, if you will. So anyway, Team 8 is the Eric Schmidt Unit 8200 cybersecurity company incubator going on right now. Here is a little video of Keith Alexander sitting with the head of Team 8, Nadav Zafrir, talking together at an Israeli cybersecurity conference. Here you have, let me go up to the top. IronNet is also part of the Istari network, right? Which describes themselves as a network of innovative cyber companies. Okay, so you have IronNet here, and you also have it being supported by Team 8 and something called Clear Sky. This is not the same Clear Sky that was in my CTI League article, but it is a venture capital firm that was created by a former executive for Blackstone, the Wall Street firm Blackstone that I covered for the last American Vagabond a few weeks ago.
Can you go back really quickly and zoom up to the top? Well, what was the top name? Keep going.
This one?
No, the name on the list of people right there. Where do I know that one from? Synginia. Does that sound familiar to you? Stands out to me.
It sounds similar to another company that I sometimes confuse it with that's called Sepio, but this one I'm not particularly familiar with. But some of these overlap with the Cyber Defend Our Healthcare Alliance, like this one, which is an Israeli company. And some other ones, right? But interesting to see them part of this Team 8 alliance, right? Especially, see, here's Istari again, the Team 8 funded thing. You have Keith Alexander, but talking about Team 8 in context of Keith Alexander's involvement is very important because one of their recent hires is the other former director of the NSA, Mike Rogers, who succeeded Keith Alexander as NSA director. Right, so you have two former NSA directors intimately involved with this organization run by the former head of Israel's NSA, Unit 8200.
Which at the very least is a potentially gigantic, security breach. Why doesn't the government care about
this article talks about former NSA employees who say just that it's a huge national security risk for Rogers to join this organization. And there's, some of them saying it bothers me on a deep level, that these guys are going to work with foreign intelligence-backed companies. Right? But there's one really good quote in here from a former guy for the TAO of the NSA, which is like their one of their hacking units at the NSA, right? This guy is saying, Rogers is not being brought into this role because of his technical expertise. It's purely because of his knowledge of classified operations and his ability to influence many in the US government and private sector contractors.
Wow.
Wow. Right.
That's crazy.
I mean, it's outrageous. Yeah. So
that's
anyway,
the kind of thing that you often point out, that this is something that you'll see in the Israeli media, that they'll just absolutely say it, whereas the Western press will try to spin it in a way that makes it, it shows you the different drives that they have. The Israeli media, in my opinion, is definitely trying to kind of flaunt their power over the U.S. government to their constituency, and that's what the difference is there. I mean, they're just straight up saying it. We have control over the U.S. government.
It's really insane. And anyway, as I mentioned earlier, the CTI League, this is my article about the sorry, stupid cat.
Okay.
This is about I should really throw him out of the room. Anyway, this is my article on the CTI League for people that are interested to go and read it, talking about the anonymous volunteers. It was founded by Unit 8200 and Microsoft. And is now being promoted by a U.S. federal agency called CISA, which is under DHS, that is now run by a former executive of Microsoft, who is also, incidentally enough, pushing for Microsoft's election guard to be, enacted nationwide. which is interesting considering that the agency he oversees, CISA, is involved with protecting election infrastructure. So let's say, for existence, something goes horribly wrong with the election in 2020, then he can say, oh, we need election guard. It's kind of in his interest, maybe.
And that makes me think of putting people in place in the human trafficking networks to be able to control those levers. That's the same thing here. Getting people in the right positions to be able to act like you're protecting the election while really being the very conduit by which it is affected. That's interesting. And this is the piece. These are the pieces being put in place as I see it. Being justified by COVID-19 by and large. All around the world, all these agendas that people have been talking about for decades or even recently are all being pushed into position right now. I just think we can't ignore that. This article, if you guys haven't read this, you very much need to read this or watch the video where we discuss it. This is a chilling one that shows you the kind of things we're talking about.
Right. Because it, in my opinion, and as we'll get into here in another second, the next part of where I'm going here, it seems like assets are being put in position in order to justify a false flag cyber attack that will be blamed on Iran that is likely to target healthcare infrastructure and the power grid. Okay. If you read this article on CTI League, it talks a lot about that, how Microsoft and the Unit 8200 guy that co-founded this have been setting up a lot of the foundation for that narrative, accusing Iran of cyber attacks against the US without any evidence that has been released to the public anyway. So definitely worth keeping that in mind. But now I'd like to go into the people. So we went over how the NSA, former NSA directors now involved with CIA contractors like Amazon, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos having ties to the Epstein scandal, and then, you know, Keith Alexander and Mike Rogers, two former NSA directors now tied up with Unit 8200's Team 8. Right. So now we're going to go into the current head of the Director of National Intelligence, the head of the entire U.S. intelligence community, who was nominated to that position in late February by Trump, even though he has no intelligence expertise at all. He was previously the U.S. ambassador to Germany. Richard Grinnell, who is actually a total Zionist lobby operative, used to work for author Arthur Finkelstein and Associates, who was one of the main architects of Netanyahu's first campaign in 1996, which was largely funded into its success. It was a successful upset win for Netanyahu. It was largely bankrolled by Ronald Lauder, a close associate of Trump and a member of the Mega Group, right? And Finkelstein was connected to Netanyahu's campaign by Ronald Lauder. Right, so Grinnell worked for Finkelstein, or got paid by Finkelstein for a while, and Finkelstein also works on has worked on numerous campaigns in Israeli politics. I think Finkelstein's dead now, actually, but while he was alive and Grinnell was working for him, you know, he did a lot of these campaigns for people like former head of the Israel's defense ministry, Avigdor Lieberman, who has a lot of very disturbing quotes about murdering Palestinians that are on the record. Anyway, for more information, you can, check out this article. Here's the head of the Zionist Organization of America, Morton Klein, with Richard Grinnell. Klein praising his appointment, saying there's never been a better friend of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship than Ambassador Grinnell. And now he's in charge of the U.S. intelligence community, essentially. This should be very alarming. Also, on my Twitter thread, I don't have it up on the tabs, Richard Grinnell has written several articles about the danger posed by Iran, and is a total Iran hawk. So you have Richard Grinnell right at the very top of the U.S. intelligence community right now, but the current NSA director of cybersecurity is a woman named Ann Neuberger. She is married to Yehuda Neuberger, chair of AIPAC's executive council in Baltimore, okay? And Neuberger's parents were rescued by Benjamin Netanyahu's brother, Jonathan Netanyahu, who actually died in that incident. I
just am completely speechless. And this isn't, I didn't know that. And the fact that we can be talking about an NSA director literally being having very clear interest, you know, just conflict of interest, let's put it, with a lobbying group. It's almost it's disgusting how obviously our government in this country is willing to just omit or overlook any kind of conflict of interest, such as Moncef Slaoui being hired as the vaccines are, these kind of things, yet then impose this kind of moral righteousness on the rest of the world. It really bothers me. I don't understand how that can be even allowed. Isn't that considered an obvious, you know, so
yeah, but it didn't come up when she was hired. There was no complaint from Congress. Of course, we can assume because of the Israel lobby's influence on Congress, right? But really quick, Neuberger oversees the NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate, which unifies NSA's foreign intelligence and cyber defense missions and works to prevent and eradicate threats to national security systems and critical infrastructure. So you have the guy at the DHS agency, former Microsoft executive Chris Krebs, promoting CTI League, protecting critical infrastructure on one side, and the other person in the intelligence community responsible for protecting critical infrastructure right now is married to one of the part of the executive council of AIPAC, and her parents were rescued by Netanyahu's brother. She says in articles, I would have been an orphan if Netanyahu's brother didn't save my parents, right? I mean, it's just, it's a little concerning. But as we go into here, right, she's also part of the same, in the same religious circle as Jared Kushner with Chabad Lubavitch. I don't know how much people know about that, but it's worth looking into. The last head of that movement, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and his influence on Israeli prime ministers. There's actually documentaries of pretty much every Israeli prime minister since Menachem Begin, talking about how how he was very influential on their, no negotiation policy with the Palestinians, and, current very far right policies with respect to occupied Palestine. A lot of that came from Chabad Lubavitch. She's also talking about here, this is Ann Neuberger's father, George Carfunkel, one of the richest people in New York State, right? Talking about how they have a $3.2 billion fortune, right? Very wealthy family. Interesting to see their involvement here. And then here it says Ann Neuberger. This is before she was appointed, promoted to this new policy. They're very involved in these foundations. Here it talks about, Benjamin Netanyahu's brother mounted a daring rescue of him.
I imagine it's quite easy to amass such a fortune when you've got inside information from all these different intelligence groups, and think about that inside information from the vault to stock market and so on. Yeah.
Right. And so we come back to Keith Alexander now. Keith Alexander thinks the scariest cyber adversary the US faces is Iran. What do you know? Okay. And so you can read this. This is from the Washington Post, talking about how Iran is emotional and will attack us because they're emotional. Okay.
Clearly history makes that obvious, right? We can clearly see all the times Iran is emotionally
yeah, I mean, it's so insane. But anyway, here are a sample of the articles, right? Quoting Keith Alexander's IronNet, saying officials worry Iran will target defense contractors with cyber attacks. Here's one article. If it'll load, here we go. Vice President of Strategy at IronNet Cybersecurity, former Department of Justice official, saying Iran is going to act now and attack us all. Okay, and then here's another one quoting the same guy. Cyber war with Iran, how vulnerable is America, from earlier this year, right? Also quoting the same guy from IronNet Cybersecurity, saying, Iranians are going to respond to the U.S. assassination of Soleimani. It will most likely be a major cyber attack. Okay, so they're like, it's IronNet, it's FireEye. By the way, the co-CEO of IronNet used to be the head of FireEye, right? And then you have Clear Sky, who I talk about in my CTI League article, and Microsoft, also part of the CTI League, that have been really setting up this foundation, this narrative over the past year that Iran is going to attack the US power grid and all of this stuff, right? I also talk about it on my Cyber Reason series. And here's yet another one of this guy from IronNet, right, saying that Iran is going to attack us. with a cyber attack. Oh, sorry, that shouldn't be there. But and here's another article from not that long ago. Iran has laid groundwork for extensive cyber attacks on the US, say US officials, has petitioned cyber weapons to hit private firms and infrastructure, right? This is all quoting anonymous US officials, okay? And then Mother Jones, which is supposed to be a liberal, left-wing, website. Here's what a cyber attack by Iran might look like, also citing, IronNet and a bunch of other fun guys like FireEye, who I just mentioned. It's the same intelligence-linked cybersecurity firm cited in this stuff consistently, telling you that, oh, it's Iran, or oh, it's China, or oh, it's these guys, and they never make any of their evidence open to public scrutiny. And they give these like mealy-mouthed, super vague explanations for why they think it's, this government or that government, as I point out in my CTI League article in my Cyber Reason series. Okay, but so they're saying Iran has set up all this stuff to attack the US with cyber attacks of the power grid, but who actually is in, what foreign intelligence agency is intimately involved in the US power grid? Well, Impressed expands in North America to assist utilities lead to transition to the Internet of Energy. All right, talking about Impressed, they've partnered with the New York Power Authority, have access essentially to the entire New York power grid. They're also in California and utilities throughout North America and around the world. Okay, so who is Impressed? Impressed is, if it will show up here, yes, they are based in Israel, but they are owned, well, I'd rather you read it, so it's not just right. So Impressed was started in 2003. Half the company was sold to Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, which created Iron Dome. Impressed created the algorithms for Iron Dome. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems is owned by the Israeli government, okay? Pretty alarming. And of course, the US bought Iron Dome systems, Iron Dome co-developed by Raytheon and Rafael, right? By the way, US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, a former lobbyist for Raytheon, so he loves Iron Dome. But the Army did not, because they scrapped plans to purchase more, because Israel would not give them access to the source code of Iron Dome, which Impressed created, even though it caused them to lose out on billions of dollars of future sales, right? Because they refused to let them see what was in the code for Iron Dome missile defense.
I argue that's because it doesn't actually work the way that they're being sold that it does.
Or it has a very obvious back door.
That's a good point too. And that's actually, I think we could argue it could be both actually, but I think it's interesting that there's been leading munitions experts in Israel that have stated that this thing is more just a big fireworks show. Now that in and of itself could be some kind of a ploy, but there's an interesting topic there to dive into. The idea that this is really, and then like I mentioned earlier, that the U.S. taxpayers are funding this to a large degree, if not entirely, and then the U.S. government is deciding to buy them back. That's disgusting, and it's just an example of everything else that we're talking about. And since I'm speaking, I'll go ahead and throw in the point that all the stuff that you referenced there is literally while Israel and arguably the United States are continually attacking Iran with cyber attacks. I've been reporting on this in the last American Vagabond for a long time, and it's like and that's interestingly something we left out of the interview with Robert Inlakesh just had, talking about Syria, Lebanon, and everything else. But they've basically admitted that they've been doing this, and it's for bad guy Iran stuff.
Yes. But there's a reason for this, and this is how I'm going to end this whole thing about why does all this matter? Why does it matter that you have people like Ann Neuberger in charge of the NSA's cybersecurity directorate? Why does it matter that Keith Alexander and Mike Rogers, former NSA directors, are tied up with Team 8? Why does it matter that the current director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, is very deeply tied to the Zionist lobby? Why does it matter that you have Impressed, which is owned by, the majority stakeholder is Israel's government, essentially being installed on, a major provider of software to U.S. utility companies throughout the country and also in Europe and Australia, right? Well, Israel keeps blowing up military targets in Iran, hoping to force a confrontation before Trump can be voted out in November, from Business Insider. This is
Sorry,
as in your face.
I totally jumped your point there, but it's funny how our minds work the same way, right? It's
yeah.
Please continue. Go ahead.
No, but I mean, this is highly alarming. Israel, I pointed this out in my CTI League article as well. You can go back to a 60 Minutes interview that was done with the former director of Mossad, Meir Dagan, where he literally says Israel wants the US to bomb Iran first, and they want to make it an international conflict, meaning that the US leads the war with Iran and Israel backs up the US, but Israel wants the war. It is not to the US's benefit. Okay. That's the former director of Mossad, who later became, chairman of the board of Black Cube and all this stuff, right? Saying that on a US TV program, 60 Minutes. Okay. And now you have Israel openly admitting to the sabotage, not just of military targets like this says, but also grain silos, factories,
right.
Trying to provoke Iran into a response before November. Okay, so now you have Israel, all these guys that we've gone over saying Iran is going to attack the power grid. They're going to meddle in the election through cyber attacks and all of this stuff, right? And the timing of this, specifically the mention of in November, very concerning that we're having, people with these ties in key positions of protecting our critical infrastructure at a time when they are saying, Iran's going to attack these same systems, and Israel is trying to force a confrontation right now. Definitely very alarming stuff.
It's very, very, very clear. I mean, the way you laid it out there, and if you are not seeing this for what it ultimately is to some degree, then you're just not looking at it. I mean, to me, to have this kind of, and especially with the history of this very government doing exactly that, it's amazing how we ignore these things. And at the very least, from a country screaming about meddling and election, and it's happening right in front of us. Right. It's a pick and choose kind of scenario, and that's excellent, the information there, and I hope people really digest all.
The Senate report, by the way, on Russiagate or whatever that came out recently talks about how all the Israeli ties that there were to election meddling in 2016. Right. And now you have what's going on right now, all this preceding of the narrative of complete election chaos, simulations by Unit 8200 run Cyber Reason, right, saying that there's going to be cyber attacks on the US on election day, and all of these things we've talked about already. I mean, there definitely seems to be some sort of push there. So if a cyber attack blamed on Iran happens to emerge before the end of the year, it's worth keeping in mind the people that were charged with protecting that critical infrastructure have conflicts of interest with the very government trying to force the US into a war with Iran right now. What's going on? This is nuts. This should be a huge story, but it's not, but it needs to be.
Yeah, it's like so many other things that we talked to. Some things should be bombshell news. I mean, I just made this reference about COVID-19 since that's what we're going to get into next, that it's any one of the things we've actually talked about. We should already see actions being taken, people being arrested, but yet the opposite. Nothing's happening, and we're actually continuing to go in the direction of the things that we're proving aren't actually even there. It's astounding.
Exactly. And COVID-19 has definitely also been another enabler of all the stuff we just went over about like getting companies like IronNet, Keith Alexander's IronNet, and a lot of these other companies like the CTI League and all that stuff into the healthcare IT systems and hospital IT systems and all of this stuff for free, right? I mean, that was all accomplished under the guise of, we're helping, our country fight the COVID-19 crisis. We're so great, so just another example of, how at least one faction of the power structure is trying to capitalize off of the scamdemic, right?
Absolutely. And let's try to fly through these last parts, because I almost feel like we should just leave that first part of the show because it was so solid. It really was a great bunch of information. So let's go through some of these things just because it's similar discussion and things. These are some of the things that you actually sent me. Just the idea that, going off of what we just talked about too, whether it's the idea of artificial intelligence and surveillance to fight, human trafficking or terrorism or mass shootings or COVID-19, as the point you made very clear, that it's all converging into one agenda. And as Tony Blair is saying, common sense move towards digital IDs. We have this article talking about COVID-19 strengthens the case for digital ID cards. And again, think back to the idea of the irises scanning, and these say they're tied in with ID 2020, the vaccination records. It's so clearly tied in together. And you also pointed out this one, which is just disgusting and alarming at the same time.
Yes.
A smart toilet can read your anus like a fingerprint, says scientists, because that totally makes sense. But
it's gone too far. That's where it goes too far. But I think honestly, this is like the people building this Orwellian panopticon, they're like making fun of us, I think. Like, you know what, they'll accept us scanning their buttholes, you know, so let's roll this out and see how many sheep, like, you know, just bend over and take it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, seriously.
It's honestly just like an in your face thing, you know. It's so gross though.
The idea of this one though, that seems so
imagine being the scientist who's like, yeah, I'm going to develop an algorithm to read people's buttholes. I mean, it's literally madness.
I mean, it is. I mean, even with the concept of, I mean, this is the point they made the other day. This is stemming off the idea that somehow your toilet is spreading this, but it is fundamental. It doesn't make sense. Plumbing doesn't work that way. That suggests somehow that what goes down your neighbor's toilet or sink is going to end up in your toilet. That's just, it's not the way it works, but they're playing on the ignorance of people. And so this is just, this is a step further from that absurdity, but it's all of this today is absolutely ridiculous. And to go on to the mass discussion, this is what really stood out to me of the absurdity of all of this. Biden walks back his national mask mandate over a constitutional issue. And the whole argument here is that he's talking about national versus state, but it's the same idea. It talks about constitutional rights. So I made the point. So let me get this straight. Both the Republican and the Democrat candidate for the U.S. president are now saying that mask mandates, let's just say national there, are unconstitutional, and yet they're still enforced, still being used to restrict and arrest Americans. It's, what? Like, how is this happening right now, right? I mean, it's incredible that we're seeing these things fall apart in front of us and they're still pushing them in. I mean, I just love that picture too of putting that mask on.
I don't know. It just, Joe Biden, every time I see him or see him talk, I'm just amazed that people are like, there's so many people still like believing that that's like legitimate. Like he is like capable of like, you know, functioning and talking and like dressing himself, and you know, it's nuts. But yeah.
And I mean, truthfully, it's not, that's not even meant to be like an insult. I mean, the guy is clearly struggling.
I know, it's like, it's elder abuse, honestly. Like, I think Joe Biden was an awful politician, accomplished awful things, but I feel bad for how he's being like paraded out, why he's like, you know, clearly too old to be in this game. And then you have Kamala running around being like, look, I'm wearing skinny jeans and Converse shoes. I'm so hip and young. Why you have like Biden can barely talk because he's like, his brain is melting from old age.
And I agree with you. I mean, I actually feel bad, but at the same time, I still hope he goes to prison, right? So let's make that clear too. Two things there. But here's the same point though on this, and this is what brings you to, like, so even within this argument, people are trying to play, oh, well, they do this and they do that, and he's only talking about this, and we should still be wearing them, you know, save your grandma and the whole thing. And yet here we are, where we're actually finding a study that's coming out now from Swiss Policy Research that, again, as always, it's just one more thing. It's not all encompassing and shouldn't be the only thing you think about when you reference this. But as it reads directly from the study, quote, the meta-study, which claimed, this is from the Lancet, a risk reduction of 80% with face masks is seriously flawed on several levels and should be retracted. And as I just point out, let's see if they actually do anything, talk about it, or just ignore it entirely. No. Here's the actual study. It said right here. And I mean, Swiss Policy Research is a well-respected outlet in regard to studies and these discussions. And it says, however, the meta-study, which claimed, I just read, that they should be retracted. And the points they make here, 7 studies that they reference in the Lancet are unpublished and non-peer-reviewed. You know, this is exactly the point they try to throw when we're talking about these studies. And so they actually did exactly what they're claiming we're doing. Isn't that the most absurd thing?
Wow.
And 29 studies considered this meta study. Only 4 are about SARS-CoV-2.
Wow.
4.
Yeah, that is major scientific malfeasance. I mean, it just shows that, you know, when politicians, especially like establishment Democrats, right, go around claiming, but the science says, a lot of times, you know, that argument fails to take into account how compromised a lot of academia is. Remember all the ties between academia and intelligence agencies or corporations, like, like departments of agriculture at a lot of US universities are funded by Big Ag and Monsanto and all of this stuff, right? And so, a lot of the ones involved in pharmaceutical studies are, compromised by Big Pharma, or the ones involved in vaccine studies are compromised by the vaccine industry. This doesn't get covered enough. And, if you fund a study, and you're a shady guy and you fund a study, you can often get a scientific study that says exactly what you want it to say. And here we have an actual analysis of a study that, by all appearances, appears to have been that. Because if you're going to talk about the effectiveness of masks for COVID-19, and you do a meta study of 29 studies and only 4 of them are about COVID-19, I mean, that is obviously, like, the scientists are not stupid that made this. They knew what they were doing, and they knew that they were gaming the numbers to benefit a particular narrative. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. For people that want more information about the complete manipulation of a lot of these scientific studies, James Corbett has done a lot of really good work, and a couple podcasts about this topic that I definitely recommend, because it's definitely a huge problem that precedes COVID-19 by a big, a big margin.
And the big point that, it all boils down to the funding through the groups that you're pointing to, right? And the idea that these scientists, researchers, they know that they need that funding to exist in the field that they're in. So they play their moral game too. And they may even convince themselves, if I do this, I can do good later. It's sort of like a politician, right? Mm-hmm. And so they fall into it, and it becomes a moral gray area. And I should point out too, that is the same concept that they were throwing at us as well, saying that, well, you're pointing to studies about influenza from 2018. And so it's not that it's completely invalid, but they're doing, that was my point, exactly what they claimed invalidated our discussion. So again, to your point, they're knowingly doing the thing, that they're being dishonest, period. Right. And it's just so clear. And it says, of the 4 studies relating to COVID-19 or to SARS-CoV-2, 2 of them were misinterpreted by Lancet. It's just, and this stuff is easy. This is actually exactly what I went over on my show, right? I'm going, look, here's what the Lancet's showing you. This is why it's not true. And thank God we have somebody out there who's producing it as well. One of them actually showed no benefit of face masks. Why'd they include it, right? They do this because they know that most people won't actually go through it.
Well, also mainstream media, if they make a meta study that's biased like this, and it has just, they just put the conclusion that supports the narrative they want in the abstract, they know that they can send that as a blurb to a bunch of mainstream media organizations that won't dive in or look at, the actual study itself, and will just repeat what the study found, right? Exactly. Just like that new article that was in UK media saying, you can get coronavirus if people sing happy birthday, study says, was the headline. And it's like, what kind of freaking scientific study was about COVID-19 and singing happy birthday? I mean, come on, people.
That's social engineering. I mean, that's you might as well just say you can get it when people open their mouths. Like, why happy birthday? Like, that's right. It's don't like celebrate. No more birthdays is sort of what that's leading people towards. The elimination of the birthday. We'll soon all be Jehovah's Witnesses. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, but it's ridiculous. Like, that's the kind of over the top. Like, don't look when you're crossing somebody. Make sure you look the other direction. Like, I've seen signs that say that. And it's like, so they got a mask on, but at the same time, it's just all it's meant to manipulate our connectivity with each other. That's how I see it.
Right. Lack of gatherings, just social interaction in general. That's what a lot of the mass is about, the social distancing, the laws, like the one coming up in the UK saying that you will be breaking the law if you gather with more than 6 people, and all of this stuff at a time when, like, the amount of coronavirus or deaths attributed to coronavirus in the UK is like at a low, like lower a multi-month low. Right. And they're saying, oh, we had to do this because of the virus. And you see the stuff being justified in Australia because of this. It's all about cutting off interaction. And I think a lot of this and a lot of the other things going on are about wearing people down psychologically and emotionally, so that when all this pre-planned chaos and these false flag attacks that are coming this fall happen, people are as ill-equipped as possible to respond to them and to think critically about what's going on. And are more willing to accept that stuff. So I think that's what a lot of this stuff is, getting people, oh my God, getting people tired, you know, from the lockdowns. Okay, now we're locked down. Okay, now we're going back to normal. Oh, not quite yet. We're locking down again. You know, kind of this cycle of wearing people out and wearing people down, saying you can't do this and you can't do that. The things you used to enjoy, you can't do anymore. This is banned. This is not banned. We'll never go back to normal. You know, all of this stuff is conditioning people to be upset and emotionally not okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna have to take the cat out of the room. Just give me one
Go
second.
ahead. No, go ahead. I'll just point out.
I'm so sorry.
As it says here in the study, that the authors of the Lancet meta study acknowledge that the certainty of the evidence regarding face masks is low. Now think about that. Since you're back already, I'll just repeat it. It says the authors of the Lancet meta study acknowledge that the certainty of the evidence regarding face masks is low, as all of the studies are observational and none is a randomized controlled trial. Yet, don't forget the beginning, that the argument of the study is that 80%, right? Think about that they acknowledge within it that no, it's not really that strong at all. But yet all of the media outlets parroted this as the proof that they work. Think about how incredible that is, right? And this is, I mean, I hope people will go through this, because more than just this in general, but it says, as shown in the analysis, the World Health Organization commissioned meta-study of the effectiveness of face masks and social distancing, published in the Lancet, is seriously flawed and should be retracted. Health authorities may want to reconsider this. Now, that is a huge statement. If this is not acknowledged by the mainstream media, whether to say it's fake or here's why or whatever, just ignored, I think that gives us our answer today. There's so many things that are being ignored, and the absence of something, like that's what I used to say, that the absence of discussion in the media, that's where the news is. That's where the news is happening, when they're not talking about something. And that's very clear to me. Now, we could actually finish here if you'd like to, because I know you wanted to make some comments on AstraZeneca, on this new development that I thought was interesting, which I'll probably follow up more on another show. But as he's pointing out here, this company needs it to immediately disclose exactly what's going on with their coronavirus vaccine trial. We're getting word that the unexpected adverse reaction in a participant is a female hospitalized with transverse myelitis, if I believe how you say that correctly, that includes loss of use of her hands and feet. And it says the New York Times itself confirms that the transverse myelitis is the unexpected adverse reaction of this COVID-19 vaccine. Quote, a volunteer in the UK trial had been found to have transverse myelitis in an inflammatory syndrome, an inflammatory syndrome that affects the spinal cord and often sparked by viral infections. That's incredible. I mean, of course, I haven't seen, maybe you have, I haven't seen a peep about this in the mainstream media. What are your thoughts on it?
Right. Well, what's interesting about the AstraZeneca vaccine is that it, out of all the other vaccine candidates globally, is trying to position itself to be the global vaccine of choice. They have deals with Trump's Operation Warp Speed. Emergent Biosolutions will produce the AstraZeneca vaccine in the US. We've talked about them a lot. They're the company that is tied to the anthrax vaccine debacle, also the anthrax attacks, selling and producing faulty vaccines and biodefense products and selling them to people anyway, even when they know that the stuff doesn't work or is untested or is unsafe. So AstraZeneca is a UK pharmaceutical company, but it's worth pointing out that this vaccine was actually produced by Oxford University. It was produced by two researchers who actually have their own vaccine company that their name is left out of this vaccine a lot, but it's called Vaxitech, and it also stands to make a huge amount of profit from the sale of this vaccine. AstraZeneca's vaccine has secured the sale of millions of doses, not just to the US government, but Australia's government and basically all of Latin America. Mexico and Argentina are going to produce this vaccine with the intention of having it be supplied to all of Latin American countries. They're also doing trials right now with this vaccine in Chile, which I believe were not actually paused even when this news came out, that they excluded the Chile one. This is worth pointing out because Chile, since the coup, US-backed coup in 1973, has essentially been a laboratory for the US government and associated interests, including the pharmaceutical industry. So it's definitely, you know, concerning there, but I'm actually planning to do an expose on some of the Oxford researchers, because one of them is actually attended and gave a talk at an institution that is the renamed British Eugenics Society. and has some very disturbing associations to that, and funding that is very suspect, and has from organizations that have a long and storied history with eugenics, even well after World War II. For example, the organization in question, where this one of the researchers behind this vaccine was speaking, wasn't renamed, didn't take eugenics out of its name until 1989. Imagine how gung-ho you have to be about eugenics after everything that went on with World War II to keep eugenics in your name until 1989. And the guy giving this vaccine, or that helped create this vaccine, it's two people. One of them went and gave a talk there, and then the major organization or foundation really backing them also has a lot of ties to the eugenics movement of the past, and is currently the host of the entire archive of the Eugenics Society's documents, which they say they need to be preserved. And if you read their description of eugenics, they basically say like, oh well, it's misunderstood and it was actually really great until the Nazis ruined it for us, which is like just out of control. So definitely this vaccine is worth paying attention to, just because there's no other vaccine being developed for coronavirus right now that is being deployed on a global scale like this one. They also have deals, for example, with China, which of course we know China is producing their own COVID-19 vaccine candidates, but AstraZeneca is going to be, that vaccine is going to be sold there as well. And like I said, you have Australia, you have Latin America, literally every country in Latin America is pretty much going to be buying doses of this vaccine, which now are being tied to this major, adverse reaction causing nerve damage. Just totally outrageous. Very disconcerting to me is the fact that this may be covered up, because they're already claiming this woman is going to be discharged from the hospital Wednesday, and they're going to resume the trials after that anyway. What if the loss of her use of her hands and feet is permanent? We may not hear that from mainstream media, and they just may continue, because like I said, there are tons of money is on the line for these massive companies. And if, it's a race to the finish to who can get approval first, and, begin the feeding frenzy, over profits from the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And this is one of the companies doing that. It's definitely, problematic to say the least. So
I just find it's incredibly gross to watch the way that this the vaccine, like, what's the right word for it? It's an industry, obviously, but it goes so far beyond that. The governments that are involved, and the way that they all just kind of allow this stuff to happen, whether we can see them like with Moderna, the way that these people working on the vaccine have patents on this stuff, and that they're financially invested with the profit side. I mean, it just goes so far outside the bounds of what we're told is supposed to be the way these things work. And we see the same thing with AstraZeneca, and it's just clear that they're all in on this game. They're all allowing each other to take these dishonest actions and pretending like it's all good. It's all altruistic, and we're removing liability because they're doing a good thing for us. It just doesn't, it's clear there's dishonesty around all of this. And on the point of, as you're like laying shade to this announcement, I find this interesting. As Spiro shared, Fauci pausing vaccine trial for safety review is not uncommon at all. In other words, vaccine side effects are not uncommon at all. And that's a good point to make there. That's what he's saying. But they're trying to downplay the idea of how these things fumble and stop. And the point is it's being rushed, and it's alarming. And I wanted to include this. Go ahead if you want to comment on that.
No, go for it.
I wanted to include this as well. I found this to be really interesting with the same tie-in, because AstraZeneca is the one that's being pushed as kind of the global, for everybody around the world kind of concept. Yet here we're now seeing this pull back from the United States, saying that, well, no, we're kind of putting our eggs in this basket. We're going to focus on ours, which I argue is Moderna, which it ultimately seems to be going in the same direction, right? But I wanted to point out that I saw this article come out where now they're trying to suggest that is him seeing what we were talking about and pulling back the funding from the World Health Organization and Gavi and all this different stuff. And as the article says, President Trump deals a huge blow to the Bill Gates and withdraws funding. And I just want to make a clear point here. So as I'm seeing this article all around today, it's a shell game, as we pointed out before. Sort of hard to deal a blow to the group one is funding. U.S. aid still funding Gavi with over $1 billion, and Trump's admin directly gave over $1 billion also. And the State Department makes clear, and this is an article from the Washington Post, asked to comment on this exact decision, this is what they're framing as Trump pulling away from Gavi and all of this, the State Department pointed to the U.S. funding for Gavi, making it like, see, look, we're still funding them, right? And so they're refusing with this article to acknowledge that that is what's happening, that they may be pulling away from the COVAX group with the AstraZeneca and the whole group, the global vaccine push, but they're still funding Gavi. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and through that, the World Health Organization. So it's a shell game happening here.
Well, this article, I would argue, is sort of an election season type thing, sort of framing Trump as tough on China and Joe Biden loves China and all this stuff, and trying to play up those differences between the two candidates when, I would argue there really isn't in terms of like policy. Obviously, rhetoric, there's a huge difference between Trump and Joe Biden, but in terms of the policies, they support, their, military industrial complex, big pharma, Wall Street, all of those things. I mean, Trump and Biden, there really aren't a lot of differences in that department. I mean, definitely Trump is backed by the China hawks, of which there is no shortage in the U.S. establishment these days. There's a lot of people in the Pentagon that are like that. Mike Pompeo is certainly of that flavor, but that the China hawkishness only goes to a certain degree. For example, if these China hawks were really China hawks, why wouldn't they criticize or try and do something about Israel giving sensitive U.S. military technology to China and selling it to them? They never do anything about that, right? So I definitely think a lot of it is theater for the public to a significant degree. And this article claiming to, frame Trump as anti-Bill Gates and anti-China, I would argue it's just an election season narrative thing to try and get people to, back Trump as sort of a, similar to the tactic that was used last election cycle, like Trump is an outlier, he's going to take down the deep state and all of this stuff. Right. He opposes Gates when he doesn't oppose Gates. If he opposed Gates, wouldn't he step in and say, Microsoft, Bill Gates' company, can't control the Pentagon cloud? No, he doesn't say that, probably because Microsoft is super involved with the Unit 8200. Israel and Trump is essentially owned by the Zionist lobby. His biggest donor is Sheldon Adelson. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's super involved in all his stuff, is very clearly an operative for Israel and the U.S.-Israel lobby to a significant degree, So I think we just need to see these types of narratives for what they are. And I think some people get like gut reactions and get emotional when people shit on their favored candidate, but we don't have time for these little feel good illusions anymore of saying, yeah, but I think he's good and blah blah blah. I mean, time to take the gloves off, people, and look at the hard truth of the U.S. political establishment. Both candidates are the same shit. They might come in different color bags or whatever, but you're getting screwed either way, right? So, we can't coddle ourselves anymore about, some political savior is coming to save us from the evil billionaires. All the people that get to be presidential candidates are there because billionaires want them there,
Yeah, exactly. Example of even actions after the fact is draining the swamp by bringing in the Christian Zionist Pompeo, or, and so on, right? It's like,
or all of Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Right. Madness.
It's obvious, but I would also make sure to point out that this site in general is a notorious site for not giving the correct information or citing things they can't prove. But at the same time, it's important to see that the funding, which is a huge point for one side of this false two-party paradigm, is just simply still there, as despite them actually arguing the opposite. And you're going to see a lot about this coming out. Now, just to finish up, I wanted to make a point on the idea of another study that they're already showing as fake news on there, which is a UCLA and Stanford idea, right? And here's the study. Here's the information that literally says from 50 to 64, about a 1 in 709,000 chance of contact, and then a 1 in technically here's the article that goes over it specifically from the full article. It says for dying between 50 and 64, you have a chance of 1 in 19 million. That seems relevant, doesn't it, to what's happening right now?
Yes.
And here they are. Here's Facebook saying, no, fake news, right? As the study is present. Right. It's just incredible. And we just brought up this one the other day to end on here, the idea that this is what they're finding. Sampling bias in coronavirus mortality calculations led to a 10-fold increased mortality overestimation, right? This is from Cambridge University Press. So how in the world are we still here? How are we finding that flu is killing more people than COVID right this moment, and has been for months? And yet we're still going forward, locking people up, arresting, mask mandates, and so on. It's incredible. It really is. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this ties into what I brought up last time I was on. The people that are trying to do all this stuff under the guise of coronavirus that isn't actually related to coronavirus know that they can only use coronavirus as a justification for so long. Now, all this information is coming out. They're doing their best to keep a lid on it, right? And mainstream media in the US, by and large, is not really reporting on it, save for, a couple outlier outlets, right? But, over time, it's going to be really impossible to keep the ruse up anymore, I guess you could say. And that's when, as I argued in my last interview on the channel, right, that there's other things in the works to allow the agendas that are going on right now under the guise of coronavirus to continue march forward, even if coronavirus as an excuse is retired at some point, right, to prevent resistance of the American public and more broadly speaking, the global public from being, mounting too much resistance to the designs and plans that these billionaires and intelligence agencies and all these people have had for decades and are trying to implement right now to consolidate control for them, because they like being at the top of the pyramid. They don't want to share this, anything with anyone. They want to maintain control and they want to consolidate it. They basically are trying to usher the entire world into an era of what I would call neo-feudalism. And obviously they know that the people, the masses, right, won't willingly go along with that. So they're trying to socially engineer us to accept this type of stuff and, wear us down psychologically and feed us all these excuses, whether it's coronavirus or something else that comes down the pipeline in a few months or whatever, or war with Iran or cyber attack or who knows what, right? So there's definitely efforts in the works, I would argue, and that's why so much chaos, right, we're being told is being planned for this fall. I think it's because they know the whole charade that they've tried to create around coronavirus is falling apart at the seams. Eventually, they won't be able to keep all the scientists and doctors and nurses quiet, even if they, succeed in censoring their opinions on social media or YouTube or what have you. Eventually they won't be able to muzzle them all when it becomes abundantly obvious. And I think we're getting close to that point. So I think that's why they need all this chaos less than 2 months away, they say, right, to distract us from what they're trying to do behind the scenes. Because if we're more distracted by the situations they're creating, whether it was, the situation they essentially created with the lockdowns and all of that earlier this year, or some sort of chaotic event that they also engineer in a few months, then we are distracted by those big events and not paying attention to what these people are doing while we are distracted. And so I think it's very important that we keep in mind that's actually what's going on and start paying attention more than ever to what these people are trying to set up and how they're trying to distract us.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's all in front of us. It's all right there in front of us. You just need to look, take the time,
Right.
Think for yourself, stand up, act, research. Don't let them be the conduit for your information. Take it upon yourself. Thank you for being here today, Whitney. And I really hope people will take this information, share it. I know I keep saying I'm going to do the clips. I will eventually. I'll break this down as well and get the clips out for everybody too, so it's easier to share. But really take some time and dive through the links that will be there for you. But thank you as always. You're always a pleasure to have on the show, Whitney.
Thanks. Absolutely. Anytime.
As always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.